as it happens, developing countries are not very well equipped to handle disasters. And if you look at this slide, 95% of the fatalities that have taken place between the period 1970-2008 on account of all kinds of disasters have been in the developing countries. Just to give you a very practical example, whenever a hurricane hits, let's say, the coast of Florida or Louisiana, what do people do? They, lock up their homes, they'll board up their windows, get into their SUVs or pickup trucks and drive off to a safe location. What happens in a poor country? Firstly, you don't have an early warning, so you don't know, it just hits you on time. There's no proper transport infrastructure. There is no shelter that you can go to. So a lot of lives are lost. In Burma, in Myanmar, you would remember in 2008, Cyclone Nargis hit that country and something like 140,000 people died. And my institute did a little bit to help. We provided solar lanterns, several thousands of them, with support from the government of India, to the people who were completely out in the open, no light, nothing, and had to live in darkness. So these relief measures, may I mention, can become a major international responsibility. And therefore, it's important for us to take action by which post-event relief is not required, that we actually prevent these events. Next. 60 to 80% of the emissions reduction would come from energy supply and use and industrial processes. And here I would like to put forward a challenge that we have in Asia. One major challenge that we have to tackle in Asia is to bring about a transition in the energy sector. If we can do that, and since we are very well endowed with renewable sources of energy, that becomes something that we should target, that we should raise our visions towards and start moving determined in that particular effort. It's also true that there are several so-called negative cost opportunities. As mentioned over here, we have estimated in the IPCC that by 2030, you would have net negative cost opportunities for reducing emissions up to 6 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in the year 2030. So these are opportunities whereby you can really bring about a radical change in the future. And of course, there's no single economic technical solution. What you really need is a combination of measures, and this has to become part of our strategy. This has to be defined by our vision, and we need leadership for that, and bring about a move as part of that strategy. Next. The good news also is that if we reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, there are huge co-benefits. What are the co-benefits? Well, firstly, you will have lower levels of local pollution. So there are major health benefits from that. You would have higher levels of energy security. You would have much greater rural employment, increased agricultural production, and certainly reduced pressure on natural ecosystems. So basically, we have to devise policies that capitalize on synergies between climate protection and development. And this is very much a part of sustainable development. Sustainable development, therefore, requires that we devise these policies that produce a host of multiple benefits by which society would be able to attain sustainability. Next. Now, we have in the IPCC identified key mitigation technologies and practices. We've also assessed policy measures and instruments. But of course, there are constraints, including resistance by vested interests, which may make it very difficult to implement some of these policies. However, if we are all risk-averse individuals and a risk-averse society, then it is in our interest to follow this risk management approach. Next. We have to adapt to the impacts of climate change because there's so much inertia in the system. Even if we were to freeze emissions of greenhouse gases where they are today, for several decades, climate change will continue. So we'll have to adapt to that. But there are limits to adaptation, simply because you might reach tipping points, you might reach thresholds beyond which you cannot adapt, and therefore mitigation is absolutely essential. Next. So therefore, neither adaptation nor mitigation alone can avoid all climate change impacts. However, they complement each other, and that's what we really need to take in hand. Next, let me highlight some of the potential for renewable energy which we have assessed in a special report of the IPCC. Firstly, there are about now 1.3 billion people in the world who have no access to electricity. And they can be served if we followed decentralized renewable energy-based solutions. And at the end of my PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to show you a very short video of something that my institute has launched as a major effort to address this problem. We also know that deployment of renewable energy can reduce the threat to supply disruptions and market volatility. You know, it's a national disgrace, and I have no hesitation in saying that, for India to have gone through a day when 600 million people were without electricity. The entire grid collapsed. And you can imagine the impact that must have had on economics, human welfare, and so on. I also have an appointment at Yale, and when Superstorm Sandy hit that part of the northeast part of the US, you know, water supply was disrupted, electricity supply was disrupted. The president of Yale, who's a good friend of mine, Rick Levin, I had given him a solar torch, and he was very thankful after Superstorm Sandy. He said, because the only damn light which worked was this solar torch. But you know, that was the state of affairs. I also want to highlight the fact that we in the IPCC examined 164 different scenarios of renewable energy use, and based on the policies that you adopt, you can go up to almost 80% of the total energy supply by 2050 coming from renewables. Next, we assessed a number of stabilization levels for these technologies, renewable energy technologies, and as I said, these 164 different scenarios from studies that have been carried out, the highest was 80% of the energy supply coming from renewables in 2050. So policies have to be put in place next, by which we can promote renewables. What are these policies? Regulations and standards. And I think regulatory bodies have an extremely important role to play. Taxes and charges, appropriate energy infrastructure investments have to be made, and of course, research, development, and demonstration. Most importantly, you need a price on carbon, because if you do that, then you're creating opportunities for new technologies to be developed. Next. The global mitigation potential in 2030 is pretty large, but of course that would depend on the price you place on carbon. So I won't go into that. Next. This gives you a picture of energy poverty. That means countries, societies where you just don't have modern energy supply. And where I mentioned 1.3 billion people being without access to electricity, you have almost 3 billion people who are still burning biomass in their homes for cooking purposes. And that's a killer, because the amount of pollution women and children in particular imbibe as a result is really very harmful to their health, leads to very high morbidity and mortality. So these are numbers that can only be tackled if we use renewable sources of energy. Fortunately, renewable energy is growing rapidly. Next. You can see the growth in solar PV, and cost reductions have taken place to bring this about. But of course, a lot more research and development has to be done to accelerate cost reductions. Next. And the distribution of solar PV operating capacity. Germany has the largest, about 35.6%. But of course, there are other parts of the world also where photovoltaics are being used. Next. This gives you the market share of major manufacturers, and you know, China has been very active in this field, although they've had a few recent setbacks. But China has invested ahead of the rest of the world and therefore has a sizable share in the global market. Next. Now, one area which has a lot of promise is concentrating solar thermal power. And we, in fact, as an institute in India, have been involved in assessing large-scale solar thermal power generation, and it looks very attractive. Of course, it's very land-intensive, so you can do it only in an area where you have land available and high levels of insulation. That means solar energy inflows. Next. Wind energy has been a remarkable success story. This is where technological innovation has played an extremely important role, making it possible to generate wind power in large machines, several megawatts, bigger than a football field, and at the same time at wind speeds that earlier were thought impossible for generating electricity. Next, you see wind power capacity. In the top 10 countries, China, US, Germany, Spain, India. So these are shining examples of how a pioneering role has been played by policymakers and leaders in some of these countries. Next. The good news, as you can see, is global new investments in renewable energy are very promising, but if we have to bring about a major transition, a lot more needs to be done. And I turn to my final slide. This is what Gandhiji said. A technological society has two choices. First, it can wait until catastrophic failures expose systemic deficiencies, distortion, and self-deceptions. And self-deceptions are very important, unfortunately. Secondly, a culture can provide social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. So therefore, I think if Asia has to lead, then it has to be driven by knowledge. And I think the knowledge of where we are going if we continue on the same path, and knowledge of where we can go if we exercise choices at this point of time which are rational, which are economically attractive, and which would ensure inclusive and comprehensive development for all the people, not only of Asia, but of the planet as a whole. So as a final rounding off, I'm going to request that we show the brief video that I had promised to show you.